My name is Michael Guyette, publisher of the Lead Lag Report. Joining me today is Aleks Svetski. Aleks, I saw some of your other interviews and actually had Mark Moss on one of these spaces in the past, but introduce yourself to the audience. Who are you? What's your background? How'd you get involved, interested in Bitcoin, and what are you doing currently?
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, so brief background was I've always been more entrepreneurially oriented. So I went to university as a civil engineer and felt like I was surrounded by idiots. So I took my scholarship money and whacked it on the stock market. This was sort of 2006, 2007. I turned like 3K into 60. I thought I was a genius. Taught myself to trade options and warrants and all that sort of stuff. And then 2007 came in and I was levered up to the hilt. And then, I had this mission to become a millionaire by the time I was 20, but instead I was $250,000 in debt by the time I was 20, which was, had the gear stick in reverse. And that kind of pushed me onto an entrepreneurial path. And since then I, built a whole series of businesses. Many blew up, many were successful, sales companies, renewable energy stuff, gyms and cafes and all sorts of weird shit. And it was in 2015, 2016, I went down the Bitcoin rabbit hole. I was seeking to solve a problem. I kind of had this inkling that Bitcoin was a, sound money and a savings instrument, and that narrative hadn't really taken off. So I put together what I still believe is the first Bitcoin only dollar cost averaging app in the world. So we kind of preceded Swan and all that sort of stuff. Like it was actually Corey modeled Swan Bitcoin off what we were doing at Amber. And we essentially built like an app that allowed you to dollar cost average into Bitcoin in an automated fashion. And at the time, like everyone was laughing at me when I was raising money. They're like, what do you mean Bitcoin only? Like, I don't understand. And, it was in that time trying to educate people why Bitcoin only that I started doing some writing and writing publicly for the first time. And that seemed to hit a chord with some people. And, my writing's always been a little bit more controversial, more edgy. And I guess fast forward now, COVID and all this sort of stupidity kind of radicalized a lot of people, definitely radicalized a lot of my writing and my thinking. And, Mark Moss and I co-authored the Uncommunist Manifesto. I kind of distanced myself from Australia and, their politics and all that sort of stuff, moved overseas, left the business behind, decided to focus in more on writing. So I'm writing a book at the moment called the Bushido of Bitcoin, which is like a look at ancient warrior cultures from, the Romans, the Macedonians, the samurai and all this sort of stuff, and looking at what virtues and values we need as the world sort of transitions and shifts away from clown world, hopefully in the coming decades. And I've also embarked on a new business, which is more in the AI space. So kind of looking at building a more Bitcoin, Austro-libertarian, conservative-centric language model. So something that won't, spend the first 3 paragraphs apologizing to you about being toxic or whatever, as ChatGPT does. So that's an overview. Entrepreneurial author, it's sort of my core focuses.
So a lot we can get into here. You mentioned this idea that you saw Bitcoin as seeking to solve a problem. Is it fair to say that early adopters, early investors, maybe almost had to have a entrepreneurial framework or mindset in the case for buying Bitcoin back then?
Maybe. I mean, I feel like it depends what you mean by early adopter. Do you mean like, pre-2012 or do you mean sort of 2012 to 2016? Because I think the different cohorts, have a different profile. Like, do you have any specificity around that?
No, I mean, just in general, because using a term seeking to solve a problem, if you're an entrepreneur, you're trying to do business to solve a problem, right? So there's a commonality there in terms of wanting to build a business and then seeing Bitcoin as almost like a little business in and of itself.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could say that because the early guys were looking to solve a problem, which was sell some drugs online or do payments, internationally a lot easier. And, when Bitcoin first sort of emerged, that was one of the utilities of Bitcoin when it was really nascent, when it was really young, sort of. And I mean, that probably lasted all the way through to sort of 2015, 2016, when the new sort of narrative started to form up, which was, hey, Bitcoin is perhaps solving a larger problem than just payments, uncensorable payments or, cross-border payments, but it's solving a bigger thing. And Satoshi actually talked about this, at least in the discourse that we have from him, is this idea of, okay, there is a grand problem here, which is, if money is the technology that we use to, measure human action, resources, and all this sort of stuff, bundled in there, it's kind of this language of value. And if that can be willy-nilly changed by, one group of people, and in doing so, expense, another group, then something's wrong. The game can be rigged quite easily. So as a result, a lot of people came in the, since sort of 2017, 2018 with this new, and I believe larger narrative of fixing the money, making that sound And yeah, I guess there had to be some sort of entrepreneurial, but maybe like the ideal archetype is kind of this blend of entrepreneurial and like philosophical, at least without blowing smoke up my own ass. I feel like that's, a Venn diagram that I've always felt I fit in between. Like always try to think about the things I'm doing, not just like, just solve a problem, but what's the meaning behind it. So yeah, I think there's something there.
And actually that does go where we are today. Again, just because you mentioned AI, and I don't hear many people talk about how AI interacts with Bitcoin, but if AI is going to be pervasive, presumably there's going to be some connection there. So first of all, let's get into the current state of the narrative around AI. I have a lot of skepticism myself. My viewpoint on all this stuff is that, like is the case with most things in life, it will probably take longer and be more expensive than most people think. Just like everyone thought that we'd have, flying cars by now, we're on the path, but you still probably got a few decades maybe for that to be the case. But what does the popular narrative get right and wrong about AI before we get into how it intersects with Bitcoin?
Yeah, I mean, look, I very much echo what you just said there. I'm sick and tired of all the AI stupidity. Like, I feel like, everyone's got, this kind of Yuval Harari, like, brain in a vat, erotic fantasies, like we're going to, reach general intelligence tomorrow. Like, let's maybe dispel a few myths here. I think, number one, like when people talk about like, AI taking over or some of the more hyperbolic statements, that what they're thinking about is artificial general intelligence. And now the problem with this is like, we have no idea what the hell general intelligence even means. Like if you look at a human as an entity itself, like you don't just have cognitive intelligence, you've got like body intelligence, muscle intelligence, like endocrine, hormonal intelligence, your bones have freaking intelligence, you have this intuitive intelligence. There's all these like emotional intelligence, all these layers of intelligence, like, the ineffable intelligences of like spirituality and all this other stuff. Like that's so broad. Like, when we talk about AI specifically, we are more talking about like some sliver of cognitive intelligence. And this is where, once again, like these language models that have popped up in the last year, they're not, I really hesitate to use the word intelligence here. They're more like probability machines. What we've discovered more than anything else with these language models is that imagery and language are patterns. And we've shown with large amounts of compute and, multiple runs of, basically probability games, which is essentially what these machines do, we can emulate some sort of human sounding language. And I think part of the reason why we've, gone into such a hysteria and such a hyperbolic sort of frame is I think the internet does that to people, like, the fact that we're all connected, all this sort of stuff. Like, like, for example, I don't think, lockdowns and all this sort of stuff would have been a thing 5-10 years ago. But the fact that social media and stuff exists, I think we blow everything out of proportion in the short term. So that's sort of one reason. But I think the other reason as well is this is the first time in history that we know of that we've actually spoken to something else, and I use the word spoken in air quotes, that's not a parrot, right? That sounds like fundamentally coherent. So it's like very easy for a person to be like, oh my God, it's alive, it's real, and like kind of run with that and think that general intelligence is around the corner. So I think first and foremost, artificial general intelligence as a concept is like so far-fetched and so like, I don't think that if it ever comes, I don't think that's like for another couple hundred years. God knows even how longer than that. So that's sort of like, first of all. And I think,
by the way, I'll give you a lot of credit because I think the way you frame that is very well articulated, because the idea that intelligence is one thing is nonsense. So I think that's brilliantly said. But there you go.
Thank you. So the AGI thing, I think very similar to, all the climate hysteria, right? It's very easy to co-opt. And I think this is where some of the problems are, is like you get these, benevolent organizations like your UN or whichever stupid regulatory body wants to do something, is like they'll latch onto something. They'll be like, okay, look, people have no idea what the fuck intelligence means. They have less of an idea what artificial intelligence means, even less of an idea what artificial general intelligence is. Perfect opportunity to like stoke some fear and like put in some sort of regulatory body to save us all from, a threat that we don't even understand how to identify, right? So what you end up getting is what's happening with the language models today, and why I'm building what I'm building is I think there has been a breakthrough with language models. Hands down, you can't take that away. It's actually really interesting that you can type to something on the internet and it can talk back to you in, a linguistic form. You can ask it all these wild questions and it'll do stuff. It's very interesting. Now, what's happening upstream of that is the way these language models are built generally is you get, you do these probability runs, you're essentially playing guess the next word. So like a really simplistic way of defining what a language model is, it's like if you've used Google Gmail before or Docs, you get like the autocomplete. So it's very sophisticated, very functional autocomplete. But these are all run through, quote unquote, toxicity filters. And these toxicity filters, have basically filters for what's approved language, what is approved speech, etc. So when you hear people talking about AI regulation, what they're talking about is making these systems, quote unquote, safer. And we all know what, safe means. Like, it's a code word for I tell you what you can do because I'm here, daddy government or whatever it is to look after you. And what they do upstream is they basically like handicapped these probability engines by running them through these toxicity filters, putting guardrails on them, etc. And what you end up, and this is the danger, and like it's the danger of AI is not AGI. The danger of AI is that if language models become the new interface between us and knowledge, in the same way that kind of like when the internet first popped up, you had this kind of decentralized realm of people going in and searching for knowledge. And it was very hard to crawl, very hard to find stuff. So Google came in, they solved the problem. They created, these bot crawlers, and you had relevant information, given to you. And in the old days, people actually went past the second page of Google, right? These days, who does? Like, no, you don't even go past the first or second, suggestion on Google anymore. So that becomes the frame. It's like Plato's cave, right? It becomes the frame through which you view the world. Now, if language models are going to become the next iteration of that interface, so, this idea of a language user interface, and that's how you understand the world around you or the, any information that you choose, that you're looking to ingest. Well, it's very easy upstream to essentially make the model basically parrot out particular narratives or particular modes of discussion or particularly types of language. And what you end up getting is this like great homogenization of information and of thought. It does it through a strange sort of inceptive way, right? Is like everything that you ask, it's within an approved narrative or an approved Overton window. And that, I think, is where the real danger of AI lies, not in, robots and shit taking over the world or taking our jobs and all that sort of stuff. Like I'll tell you what, the only job that's being taken by AI is like, I'm writing an article called Midwit Obsolescence Technology. So it's like, all these dumbass, CNBC reporters or like, these run-of-the-mill journos who can't think for themselves and just write the, classic boring shit. Like, ChatGPT will do that now very well because it's like right in the Overton window and it'll just like parrot nonsense that, some, NPC with, no brain will also parrot. So anyway, what we're doing is we're trying to like build a model without those filters and, the kind of data we're training it on, as I said, is more, Bitcoin oriented Austrian economics. I love Austrian economics because it touches like philosophy, anthropology, like how society evolved, economics and all this sort of stuff. So it's like, it's quite, grounded in some sort of praxeological reality. So that way, what we hope to get out the end of it is a model that will tell you something of substance, hopefully, and, ideally, if it's not run through toxicity filters, it'll also tell you you're an idiot if, ask something stupid. So that's the plan. So anyway, maybe I've gone off on a tangent there, but
no, that's good because you echoed a lot of my own personal views on this because large language models are phenomenal, but people are confusing that with,
sentience,
Skynet, right?
Yes.
The idea, right? And, and somebody sent me a message saying, all these big companies that are talking about AI, I mean, they're basically just doing variations of Clippy, right? Like Clippy from
exactly.
back
Yeah,
then,
that's it.
right?
That's it.
Very kind of simplistic type of stuff. But it does capture the imagination of the investing public. It does create manias. Now, I jokingly have said this. We're not going to talk about NVIDIA too much, but just as more of an example, I've jokingly said that NVIDIA is now trading like a shitcoin. Narratives are not that dissimilar from a lot of the things, in quotes, projects that really had no utility that were going through the moon in 2021. Are we maybe kind of more broadly at this kind of existential moment in history where people are just naive in believing stories that are sold to them and causing these almost like concentrated bubbles in the investment landscape? Because this does apply to the cryptocurrency space as well, I think.
Totally. Yeah, I think we're in the age of the perpetual tulip, right? Is that like that is a function of time preference, right? So time preference, for anyone listening that doesn't understand what that means, is like the ratio between how much you value the future against the present. And you'll always value the present more than you value the future, right? Because there's uncertainty in the future. But if you value the present absolutely in relation to the future, you will only live right for the moment, right? And that's essentially like, you look at, animals are more like that, right? Like, a dog could be doing something, you give it some food, and it's like now, it's purely instinctually based. Now, to build civilization, you need to lengthen time preference. You need to start giving greater value to the future. And the only way you can do that is, you can force yourself to think long term, but fundamentally, savings is the civilizational tool that allows you to think longer term and to plan for the future, because when you have some savings, you reduce uncertainty in the future. And that's the function of savings in a civilization. If you break the ability for constituents of a civilization, so the people inside of society, to save, you actually skew their time preference, so they become more immediacy oriented, they become more now oriented. And in doing so, they generally become more hedonistic, or they become more prone to gamble. And this is sort of like, you couple that sort of propensity with the fact that things like social media and the internet exist and things can go viral, etc., like all the algorithms and shit. You basically have the perfect recipe for a world in which, there's a fucking new hysteria every 6 weeks, 6 months, or whatever. And, like, you layer that on top with also something like crypto, which to me is like a big fucking casino, is you end up with a world where basically all these crypto projects, they figured out the perfect hack. They're like, hey, the Federal Reserve is printing money out of thin air, so hey, we can do it too. And fuck it, we'll just do it on a, little Ethereum program, and we just made money out of nothing. Literally, just literal hands down money printing. And that's what they're all doing. And you got these 3 layers of like high time preference, where we don't value the future very well. You've got this interconnectedness with the internet and social media, all the algorithms and all that sort of stuff. You layer that with the ability to just, print money digitally through a couple lines of code, and you have the perfect storms for hysteria after hysteria. And that's what's basically fueling all of these bubbles.
Yeah, no matter how one views COVID, the reality is it sort of remind people that, death can happen at any moment in time, right? Mm-hmm. Even if you don't believe in it now, but it was still back then what everyone thought about. I may not make it till next week. So, I do think all that does kind of come together into this perfect storm where, you end up seeing more of these bursts of uneducated speculation, which some people can make a lot of money in, but becomes really challenging for those that actually want to generate real wealth longer.
Correct. Yeah, we're not in a wealth building stage of civilization. We're actually burning wealth. We have this illusion of wealth being created and this illusion of affluence, but what we're essentially doing is we're sucking that from, the capital that we've built in the past. And we have this illusion that we're getting richer in some sense, or that a few people are getting richer. But the world is one big casino at the moment. It's literally gambling all the way. And if you are smart enough to latch onto a narrative that makes sense, or you can manufacture a narrative. So there's a big case to be made that a lot of these Nvidia type companies, they know that the whole AI thing's a fucking bubble. They know it's all horse shit. So what they're doing is they are LPs in big VC firms who, the VC firms go and, the strong narrative now is AI. So they go and invest. And essentially the money just sort of like, it trickles down a little bit, it scoops up a couple people, and then it just goes all the way back up, because what are all the startups doing? They're all spending money on the GPUs at the end of the fucking day anyway. So it's like all going back through to it's all consolidating up to Nvidia and, your Googles and your Amazons and all that sort of shit. Anyway, it's like, there's going to be a very, very small amount that carves its own section out. But that's the world we live in. This is why I love Bitcoin, for example, because it's such a counter narrative to that. Bitcoin is not about like making a quick buck and all that sort of stuff. It's 21 million coins. It's fixed amount. It's about slow and steady, slow change. It's about not printing another token or any of that sort of stuff. Like it really fundamentally philosophically sits outside of all of that, and that for me is an attraction, because I guess maybe I'm just an old school, or I was born in the wrong fucking generation. I don't know. Yeah, this is a big question. There's like a couple ways to try and answer this. One of the things is that people just fundamentally have a different nature. And if you couple that with nurture, because I think, another fallacy, and I don't know how many people subscribe to this these days, but it's like that we're all nurture and like the environment, fundamentally builds you. I think it's a mixture of things, like you are fundamentally born with a nature, and then the nurture either reinforces that nature or it kind of dilutes it in some way. But I think there's things that are just going to appeal to you in some particular way, just viscerally, and that's part of your makeup. But the other way I think is also, this is history. Like I'm a history buff. I love looking at history as a narrative. And like we have always, from the beginning of time as human beings, we we learn through narrative. This is why when even like, scientists and all that sort of shit say like, oh, there's no such thing as religion. It's like religion is a narrative. It's a useful narrative because it's interested in the discussion about what matters, not matter specifically. Science is more it's an empirical study of matter. Like they're two different things, and the concepts or the methodologies for each, are very different. But coming back to sort of what I was saying is like, you need to like, history can help from a story standpoint, and you look at what stories either have repeated themselves multiple times, what cycles, what seasons have occurred. So like, Mark Moss, who I co-wrote the Uncommunist Manifesto with, he's one of those people, he loves looking at cycles and seasons and stuff like that. And that can kind of give you some sort of insight and therefore foresight. And the other thing as well is like, look at what, matches with reality. Like, so if someone's telling you the sky is green and, you look at it and it's fucking blue, you have the choice then. And this probably comes down to like personal courage, for example, is a lot of people, and there's a great experiment. I think it was the Ash experiment, or maybe it was another one. I can't remember specifically which one it was, but where they get a bunch of people in a room and basically 3 people are actors and 1 person is the test subject. And, they do a couple like experiments where, you draw each of sort of the person running the experiment shows like a couple of lines, and you're asked to like say which one is the shortest line. And there's one that's clearly the shortest, and the actors all pick the wrong one, you pick the right one. And you're like, what the fuck is wrong with these people? You do it 2, 3, 4 times, but after a while, you have this intent, like you end up conforming with what everybody is saying, even though it's a lie. You're seeing the line is shorter, you just do it anyway. And this, I think, is a function of like courage, how much you're willing to stand out, how much you're willing to like, believe your own sort of eyes, your own experience. And this then, ties into things like we have intuitive body knowledge. And I think a big part of, modern society tries to like push that out of us, tries to say, your body, your intuition, your instinct, your gut feeling, all that stuff doesn't exist. All that exists is, what the algorithm tells you, what the AI tells you, what your brain tells you, etc. And that I think is, false. So anyway, it's a mixture of these things. I think, trusting your body, trusting your gut, learning to, develop that sort of stuff, having the courage and the balls to like, see when something is one way versus another, looking at cycles, seasons, history and stuff like that helps. But, all of those things, I think, it's a mixed answer to your question. So I hope it's helpful. Okay. I mean, I'd suggest if you type in Andreas Antonopoulos and quantum computing, you'll get some, a more in-depth answer. But to dispel a little bit of confusion there. So encryption is not how Bitcoin's protected. So the encryption is to do with public-private key pairs. That has nothing to do with the network itself. So, where the concern around encryption could possibly lie is if somebody knew your Bitcoin address, could they reverse engineer your individual private key? Okay, that's the layer of relationship encryption has with Bitcoin. But in terms of like the network itself and the 10-minute blocks and everything, that's got nothing to do with encryption. That's a economic consensus model that requires participants, who are miners in this case, to expend energy trying to solve a problem, quote unquote, or to find a nonce. And if you have let's say a machine that can do that more powerfully, then you will have an advantage in playing that game of probability and have the ability to basically lock the next block. But probabilistically speaking, you would need more compute power than everybody else in the network essentially combined. So it's not encryption that protects Bitcoin. It's game theoretic economic probability. So it's 2 separate things. A lot of people always get this conflated. And then, with respect to, quantum computing and stuff like that, it's got a quantum computer will not be like quantum computer is more general purpose concept. An ASIC will always outcompete a quantum computer. And if that turns out not to be the case, quantum computers that mine will end up like, all the ASICs will convert into being quantum computers and they'll mine, and that'll just strengthen the Bitcoin network. It has that's a positive for Bitcoin. And then with the keys, the public-private key relationship, so the ability for someone to potentially reverse engineer what your private key is, because if someone has your private key, they have your Bitcoin. So your your relationship to your Bitcoin is a function of your relationship with your private key. If somebody else knows it, then somebody else has your Bitcoin. So that, could something decrypt that, the public-private key cryptography that's used in Bitcoin? Very unlikely. And, there's mechanisms to, make new address functions in Bitcoin that wouldn't require a hard fork, that would be quantum resistant, for example, if that was ever to be the case in the next 10, 20, 50, 100 years. But it's totally not a fucking problem, nothing to think about or worry about or even be concerned about at the moment.
I'm curious as far as where you think we are now in the cycle. I am skeptical of narratives. I actually very much do buy the argument that Bitcoin is a counterparty risk diversifier or play against counterparty risk, which is why I keep saying myself, I think it's going to diverge if I'm right about a credit event this time around in a risk off sequence. But are we sort of in a, some people say it's a prolonged bear market. Some people will say it's the start of a new bull market. I don't think any of these constructs matter if you're a true long-term investor anyway. But what's your sense in terms of where we are in the cycle?
I guess when I think about cycles, I think about just human psychology. Really that's what drives these kind of market cycles. And, the cycle is just merely a function of where people are in their, in the collective stages. Like, are people, at boredom? Are they at excitement? Are they at apathy? Are they at, hysteria? Where the fuck are they on the cycle? I kind of get the sense we're still probably in the boredom stage, so probably still in some sort of sideways market. There's glimmers of hope. And what markets do best is they stomp out fucking hope when there's, it's not the right time or whatever. And the markets are there to teach you a lesson because, more often you're wrong. So what I try and do when I think about Bitcoin is I just say, okay, look, this thing is the only thing that we know of that is like consistent, right? Every 10 minutes, there's a new block. Bitcoin doesn't change. There's a specific amount. It's always going to be there. That's not protected by encryption or anything like that. It's protected through social consensus. And the longer Bitcoin hangs around, the stronger that social consensus becomes. The more then capital is put into Bitcoin, the more incrementally people at an individual level and therefore at a collective level trust it, which means they'll allocate some more of their capital to it, which also means that maybe more miners will come, more node operators and all this sort of stuff. So you get this kind of like, almost like a virus that spreads through the world. More capital is invested in it. And that means Bitcoin this is not changing Bitcoin. It's not making it faster, smoother, better, any of that sort of stuff. It makes Bitcoin more consistent. And it's the consistency that makes Bitcoin special in a world that is becoming increasingly inconsistent. And that's the juxtaposition that I think matters. So when I try and explain Bitcoin to people, in that sort of a sense, they start to think like, oh, okay, so, because here's the thing, in 2, 3, 4 years, Bitcoin's still going to be doing the same fucking thing. It's going to be TikTok next block. It's still going to be a way to send, transactions in a way that can't be censored. It's still going to be 21 million Bitcoin. It's still going to be the same fucking thing is going to be there. And what you need for something like if Bitcoin is planning to solve the sound money problem, like if, we're talking about putting the world on a sound money standard where nobody can fuck with the money and therefore get an unfair advantage in the game, Bitcoin needs for multiple generations. So we're still in the first innings. Each generation is roughly 20 years. So we're still in the first innings. Bitcoin has to be there for 2, 3 generations and not change and be the thing that is still TikTok next block, still every 10 minutes, still doing the same thing. And what you'll get is this kind of psychology shift. And that'll happen in phases. As I said, the generations, I think, are the best way to sort of think about these phases. But it'll become it'll become a normal thing. It's okay, yeah, I want some safety. So I have an allocation to Bitcoin. And it's not an investment allocation. It's an allocation it's a bearer instrument that has monetary properties that nobody can take from me, if I store my private key properly, and that nobody can dictate what I can do and cannot do with it. So it's this perfect, monetary instrument. And it is still there. Being in the first, phase or first generation of, quote unquote Bitcoin adoption, there's all sorts of, competing narratives. There's uncertainty. It is a technology as well as it is a socioeconomic phenomenon. So we kind of project technology attributes onto it, which is also why we also don't trust it that much, because we're it's a technology. Maybe someone can change it, or maybe the encryption can be broken. So we don't understand how it works. So we throw around all these sort of, weird terms like, AI is coming this week and, it's crypto this fucking next week and it's, DeFi here, all these changes happening. But as long as Bitcoin stays the same, doesn't change, does its thing, more and more people will be like, shit, man, I was thinking about that Bitcoin thing 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 5 years ago, whatever. And it's still the same thing. It's still delivering on the promise of sound money, of 21 million, of uncensorable transactions, of unconfiscatable bearer instrument, shit, maybe I'll put a couple percent, 2%, 5%, 10%, whatever of, my wealth into that because I trust it more maybe than property, because maybe, I live in a country where the idiot politicians tomorrow are going to turn around and raise property taxes, or they're going to come and confiscate my property or whatever. Like, that's what sort of Bitcoin represents. So on a long enough time scale, depends on your magnification, how far you're looking, is like Bitcoin is a safety instrument. It is a certainty instrument that happens to have monetary properties. And that's why more and more people will, over time move toward it, as opposed to all of the uncertainty that is happening in the rest of the world. But, to kind of bring it back to now, like where we are at the stage of the cycle, like, I feel like from a market dynamics perspective, we're probably in some sort of, maybe boredom stage with a, glimmer of hope. Does that mean we're turning a leaf, and moving to, a more hopeful, excited stage, and therefore like a bull market? Possibly, maybe, but I think, Bitcoin is just going to keep doing its thing. There's going to keep being accumulators. People understand, what the underlying value of something like this is, and they're going to do their thing. People who don't, they're going to do their thing. They're going to look at speculating or doing whatever, etc. And yeah, the chips will, where they land is where they land, based on how willing people are to try and understand what this phenomenon is.
Everybody, make sure you follow Aleks Svetski here on X. And again, if anybody wants to come up and ask questions, click that bottom left mic request button.
Yeah, let's tease this apart. So the Bitcoin protocol is ossifying at the moment, which means it's hardening. And it's always had this tendency to harden over time. The larger it gets, the more people that are holding some Bitcoin or running a node or mining, etc., the more it ossifies. Think about it as like, it's very easy for you to choose where you want to go to dinner by yourself. When you have a spouse, like it gets, a bit more difficult. Try get like 5 people to agree on where to go to dinner. Try to figure out getting 100 people to agree on it. That's fucking impossible, right? So like the broader Bitcoin becomes, the more difficult it is to get a new consensus. Like the existing consensus will more than likely prevail. So while Bitcoin, like it's theoretically impossible to change the protocol of Bitcoin. So like I can go on my node now and I can change a couple rules. I can say, you know what, I don't want 21 million Bitcoin anymore. I want 42 million. And I can literally do that right now on my computer, no problem. And I will no longer be in consensus. I will be on my own chain of Bitcoin. So like I kind of self-select myself out of the consensus. And then I would have to go on a campaign and convince everybody in the world that Bitcoin, Alex's version with 42 million Bitcoin, is a better option than the traditional. Why? Well, because I fucking said so and I'm better looking and screw everybody. And I'd have to go on this campaign to get everybody to move over. So it's the same with any change, any consensus change on the Bitcoin protocol is like to put through any change, like people go on like multi-year campaigns to try and convince the marketplace. And then everybody who's running a node, every miner, everybody has to switch to the new consensus, which is why there's only been like 2 or 3 changes to Bitcoin, and they've been more technical in nature. They have not changed, the fundamental, you can think of them as constitutional rules, like 21 million Bitcoin, the block size, the mining encryption algorithms, the SHA-256, the public-private key stuff, like none of that stuff's been changed. Like Schnorr signatures, for example, because they were not open source, like Schnorr signatures are a better way to do public-private key encryption, and they are a hands-down better way. But the person who invented them they were proprietary at the time, like whatever it was, like 60 years ago or something like that. And at the time Satoshi launched Bitcoin, he chose an inferior public-private key encryption scheme called ESDCA. And Schnorr signatures from the start, everybody's known. Even Satoshi knew that Schnorr would be better, but couldn't use it because it was, Bitcoin was an open source thing. Even though everybody knows Schnorr signatures are better, like it took something like 15 years to get Schnorr signatures across. And that's like for such an evident change. For any other like change that could like fundamentally disturb the psychological collective consensus of how people understand Bitcoin, it's just not going to happen. So for that, Bitcoin's definitely ossified. So maybe some minor technical things, like for example, like let's just say quantum computing comes out in the next 50 years, that can potentially crack the public-private key pair. That might require some sort of consensus change by the nodes so that they recognize a new form of Bitcoin address that is related to the private key. That, would probably be like a proposal that is developed over time and would need to be flagged. And then everybody on the network would need to opt into that chain or that version, that change. And their node would need to be upgraded to run that version of the software. And it would go through multiple changes, et cetera, et cetera. So like Bitcoin is very hard to change. And like, I mean, right now there's a massive thing going on about like something that is not even like a major change. Like it's a small adaptation of Bitcoin so that you can have another second layer. So it doesn't even change, there's a very minor change to the base layer that'll allow more abstraction so that people can do experiments not on the base chain but on a second layer. And that's a battle that's been going on for like 5-6 years, and everyone's fucking arguing with each other and all this sort of shit. So it's just this thing that like, consensus is hard to achieve. And this is the big invention of what Satoshi did, is like he didn't create something that is just a program. He created something that's almost like a living, breathing, digital social constitution. And its immutability is a function of humanity's own, resistance to change. That's where the protection is. It's not in just purely mathematics. It's really mind-blowing when you start to kind of dig into it on these layers. So I hope that answers it. Like, the principles that underlie Bitcoin, like the fact of like having a sound money standard that nobody can control, that is fixed in supply, that is, consistent, and that is uncensorable and unconfiscatable. Like those principles will never go away, because those are the attributes of a perfect money. And civilization will always need a money, because in order for a civilization to function, you need a means of measuring relatively and intersubjectively time, energy, resources, and preference. Like that, like human being, like even if we somehow manage to get to a post-abundance, energy abundant, world or galaxy or whatever, you still have the problem of time, which is what do you do first? So the way you measure preference in an economy is through money, through price. So money will always exist, and it needs to have these particular attributes. And Bitcoin has cracked these attributes through solving a socioeconomic problem with, this sort of technological, consensus mechanism. It's fucking mind-blowing when you think about it in that sense.
Aleks, for those who want to track more of your thoughts and work, where would you point them to?
Yeah, I think probably my Twitter is best. I used to have a Medium where I kind of talked about some of this stuff, writing essays and stuff. But these days I'm going to go more towards, I'm going to start writing there soon again, but I'll post that also on my Twitter. So like if people follow me on Twitter, they'll learn about this stuff. If they want to go pick up the Uncommunist Manifesto, they can search for that on Amazon, or go uncommunist.com. They can grab that there. And yeah, and if they want to check out some of the AI stuff we're doing, spiritofsatoshi.ai, there's stuff in there. But I think probably Twitter is probably the easiest place.
Again, folks, this will be a podcast under Lead Lag Live. Everybody, please give a follow to Aleks, and hopefully I will see you all later. Appreciate it, Aleks.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate it for having me on. Thank you everyone for listening. I hope it was useful.